The barren master who paid a slave renowned for his beauty to secure an heir. Part 1: Introduction and Setup. Today we have a story about dignity stolen in silence, about choices made in desperation, and about secrets that poison generations. This is the account of Grace Turner, a freedwoman who witnessed something forbidden in the Louisiana twilight of 1842, something she carried to her grave, written only in a hidden journal discovered beneath the floorboards of a demolished plantation house in 1953. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Grace Turner had been born free in New Orleans, the daughter of a seamstress and a carpenter. By 1841, at 23 years old, she worked as a laundress at the Vailmont plantation, one of the few free black women employed there. She was known for her quiet dignity, her skilled hands, and her discretion. The white families trusted her with their finest linens, their most delicate laces. The Vailmont estate sprawled across thousands of acres of Louisiana cotton fields. Its master, Alexander Vailmont, was 42 years old, a man of considerable wealth and empty eyes. His wife, Celeste, was 23, beautiful as morning light and visibly withering. Grace noticed things others missed. She noticed how Madame Celeste's hands trembled when folding baby clothes for her sister's children. She noticed how Monsieur Vailmont drank alone in his study until dawn. She noticed the separate bedrooms, the cold politeness, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the household like humid air before a storm. The plantation operated under strict rules. Grace learned them quickly: never speak unless spoken to, never look the master directly in the eye, never question why certain slaves were treated differently than others. There was one slave in particular who drew her attention, a young man named Daniel, 25 years old, who had been moved from field work to stable work to house assistance over the past 3 years. Daniel was exceptionally beautiful. Even Grace, who tried not to notice such things, could not deny it. His features were fine, his bearing dignified despite his bondage. The other slaves whispered about him sometimes, but always stopped when Grace approached. In October of 1842, Grace was called to launder bedding from a small hunting cabin near the river, a place that had been abandoned for years. When she arrived, she found it had been cleaned, furnished with a simple bed, and stocked with candles. "Why would anyone use this old place?" she asked the overseer who had sent her. He did not answer. He only looked at her with an expression she could not name, something between pity and warning. That night, carrying her basket of fresh linens back toward the main house, Grace saw 2 figures walking toward the cabin in the darkness. One was Madame Celeste, wrapped in a dark cloak. The other was Monsieur Vailmont, leading someone by the arm. Grace stepped behind a tree, her heart pounding. The third figure was Daniel. Monsieur Vailmont opened the cabin door, ushered both Madame Celeste and Daniel inside, then locked the door from the outside and walked away. Grace stood frozen in the shadows, the basket of linens heavy in her arms. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Part 2: First Conflict. Grace did not sleep that night. She lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself she had misunderstood what she had seen. Perhaps Madame Celeste had taken ill. Perhaps Daniel was there to carry firewood to assist with some emergency. But the locked door haunted her. No emergency required a locked door. 3 days later, Grace was sent to the cabin again to retrieve the linens. Her hands shook as she approached. The door was unlocked now, the cabin empty, but the bed had been used. The candles burned down to stubs, and there on the floor near the basin she found a single mother-of-pearl hairpin, the kind Madame Celeste wore. Grace picked it up, her stomach turning. She returned to the main house and found Madame Celeste in the parlor, embroidering by the window. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes rimmed with shadows that no amount of powder could hide. "Madame," Grace said softly, approaching with the folded linens, "I found this near the washing basin." She held out the hairpin. Celeste's hands froze mid-stitch. For a moment, something raw and desperate flashed across her face: shame, fear, grief, all tangled together. Then the mask returned. "Thank you, Grace," she said, her voice flat. "You may go." Grace hesitated. "Madame, if you need." "I said you may go." The words were sharp as broken glass. Grace left, but the image of Celeste's face stayed with her. That night, she saw Daniel crossing the yard toward the slave quarters. His shoulders were hunched, his movements slow. When he passed beneath a lantern, Grace saw his expression. It was the look of a man carrying a weight that would crush him. The next Sunday, after church services in the plantation chapel, Grace overheard a conversation between two white women from neighboring estates. 3 years married and still no child, one whispered. Poor Celeste, her mother is beside herself. Alexander must be devastated, the other replied. A man of his stature without an heir, unthinkable. They fell silent when Grace approached to collect the hymn books. But their words echoed in her mind all day. That evening, Monsieur Valmont summoned Grace to his study, something that had never happened before. She entered with her eyes lowered, her hands clasped. Grace, he said, his voice unusually gentle, you have served this household faithfully for many months. Yes, sir. And you have always been discreet. A chill ran down her spine. Yes, sir. He poured himself a drink, his hand unsteady. There are matters in every household that must remain private, matters that, if spoken of, could destroy lives. Do you understand? Grace's throat tightened. Yes, sir. Good. He took a long drink. You will continue your duties as always, you will see nothing, you will say nothing. In return, your position here is secure and your wages will increase. It was not a request. It was a threat wrapped in silk. Grace nodded, her heart pounding so hard she feared he could hear it. As she turned to leave, Monsieur Valmont spoke again, softer now, almost to himself. We all do what we must to survive, Grace, even things that shame us. She glanced back and saw him staring into his glass, his face hollow with something that looked almost like guilt. That night, Grace wrote her first entry in the journal she would keep hidden for the rest of her life. October 21st, 1842, I have seen something that should not be, I have been told to be silent, but silence is its own kind of sin. I will record what I witness so that someday someone will know the truth. Part 3. Conflict escalates. The visits to the cabin continued. Grace knew because she was sent to launder the linens every few days. She learned to recognize the pattern: Madame Celeste's sudden headaches that required privacy, Monsieur Valmont's careful management of the household's schedule, Daniel's absence from his usual duties. November came cold and gray. Grace noticed Daniel growing thinner, more withdrawn. The other slaves whispered that he had stopped eating, stopped speaking. One morning, she found him sitting alone behind the stables, his head in his hands. She approached carefully. Daniel. He looked up and she saw tears on his face, something she had never seen from any enslaved man on the plantation. They learned early to hide such things. I can't, he whispered, I can't keep doing this. Grace glanced around to ensure they were alone, then sat beside him. What has he made you do? Daniel laughed, a broken, hollow sound. Everything, nothing, I don't even know anymore. He looked at her with eyes full of anguish. Do you know what it means to be used like livestock, to have your body treated as property in a way that makes even slavery feel less cruel? Grace's heart clenched. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that stole her breath. And Madame Celeste, she asked gently. She cries, Daniel said. Every time. She cries and apologizes and hates herself and hates me, and we are both trapped in this hell that Monsieur Valmont created because he cannot accept what he is. Grace reached out and squeezed his hand, a gesture of solidarity, of shared humanity in a world that denied it to them both. Has he promised you anything? She asked. Freedom, Daniel said bitterly. When she conceives, when the child is born, he promises papers, money, a new life in the North. But what kind of life is built on this foundation? What kind of freedom can wash away what I've done? Strange things began happening around the plantation. Madame Celeste stopped attending social functions. When forced to appear, she moved like a ghost, speaking only when necessary. Grace watched her waste away from the inside, her beauty turning brittle and haunted. One night, Grace heard shouting from the main house. She crept closer and heard Celeste's voice, raw with desperation. I cannot do this anymore, Alexander, I cannot. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face and I hate myself, I hate you, I hate this whole cursed life. Monsieur Vailmont's response was too quiet to hear, but it was followed by the sound of breaking glass. The next morning, Celeste appeared with a bruise on her wrist, poorly hidden beneath her sleeve. Grace also noticed something else, a pattern she had not seen before. Several other enslaved women on the plantation were pregnant or had recently given birth, but their children were taken away within days, sold to other plantations before they could form attachments. She realized with cold horror that this was not the first time Monsieur Vailmont had used enslaved people to solve his problems. It was simply the first time he had involved his own wife. In December, a white minister came to visit the plantation. Reverend Matthews, an elderly man known for his stern sermons about sin and righteousness. Grace served tea while he spoke with Monsieur Vailmont in the parlor. "The sanctity of marriage must be preserved," the Reverend said. "God's design for family cannot be perverted by man's weakness." Monsieur Vailmont nodded solemnly, his face a mask of piety. Grace wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the tea service to the floor and expose every rotten lie, but she was a free black woman in Louisiana in 1842. Her voice meant nothing, her truth meant less. That night she wrote in her journal, December 8, 1842, "I have learned that evil does not always wear a cruel face. Sometimes it wears the mask of desperation. Sometimes it hides behind locked doors and whispered agreements. Sometimes it destroys people slowly, politely, with their own cooperation. This is the worst kind of evil, the kind that makes victims of everyone it touches." The entry ended with a single line that sent chills through anyone who would later read it. "The cabin by the river has become a tomb for the living." Part 4, Breaking Point. In January of 1843, everything changed. Madame Celeste fainted during morning prayers. The household erupted into chaos. The doctor was summoned, servants rushed about with water and smelling salts, and Monsieur Vailmont paced the hallway with an expression Grace could not quite read. Hope, terror, both. 3 days later, the doctor confirmed what everyone suspected. Madame Celeste was with child. The announcement was made with great celebration. Champagne flowed in the parlor, neighboring families sent congratulations. The church bells rang in the small chapel. Monsieur Vailmont walked with his head higher than Grace had ever seen it. But Grace saw what others did not. She saw how Celeste's hands shook when she accepted congratulations. She saw how Daniel disappeared into the fields, assigned to the hardest labor suddenly, as if Monsieur Vailmont wanted him as far away as possible. She saw how the locked cabin by the river remained locked, but now with boards nailed across its door, sealed like a coffin. One afternoon, while delivering fresh linens to Madame Celeste's room, Grace found her sitting by the window, one hand on her barely swollen belly, tears streaming silently down her face. "Madame," Grace said softly. Celeste did not turn. "Do you believe in God, Grace?" The question startled her. "Yes, Madame." "Then tell me," Celeste's voice cracked, "tell me if God can forgive a woman who has conceived a child in sin, a child built on lies and shame and the suffering of an innocent man." Grace set down the linens and approached carefully. "Madame, you are not the one who—" "I agreed to it," Celeste whispered. "Alexander presented it as the only solution, and I was so desperate to become a mother that I agreed. I let him use Daniel like an animal. I participated in it. I am as guilty as my husband." Grace knelt beside her chair. "The child is innocent, Madame. Whatever the circumstances of conception, the child is innocent." "But what if—" Celeste turned to face her, eyes wild with fear. "What if the child looks like him? What if anyone can tell? What if I give birth to my own destruction?" Grace had no answer for that. The months passed slowly. Celeste's pregnancy progressed normally, but her mental state deteriorated. She stopped sleeping. Grace would find her wandering the halls at night, whispering to herself. Sometimes she called out for Daniel, sometimes she wept for forgiveness. Monsieur Vailmont seemed oblivious to his wife's suffering. He was too busy preparing for the heir, purchasing the finest cradle, hearing the best nursemaid, planning the christening that would announce to society that the Vailmont line would continue. In March, Grace was sent to deliver a message to the fields. She found Daniel working under the brutal sun, his hands bleeding from picking cotton. When he saw her, something broke in his expression. "Is she well?" he asked quietly. "The pregnancy progresses," Grace replied, careful of who might overhear. "And after, when the child is born, will he keep his promise?" Grace wanted to lie to offer hope, but she had seen too much. "I do not know." Daniel nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I think about running," he said. "Every day I think about it, but where would I go? How far would I get? And that child," his voice broke, "that child carries my blood and I will never know it, never hold it, never tell it the truth." "Perhaps that is mercy," Grace said gently. "Perhaps the truth would only bring more suffering. Or perhaps the truth would set us all free," Daniel replied. That night, Grace wrote in her journal. March 15th, 1843, "A child will be born soon, an innocent life conceived in desperation and despair. I wonder what God thinks when he looks down on this plantation. I wonder if he weeps." The next day, something happened that would haunt Grace for the rest of her life. She was crossing the yard when she saw Monsieur Vaillemont speaking with the overseer near the stables. Their voices were low, but Grace's hearing was sharp. "When the child is born," Vaillemont was saying, "you will have Daniel ready to depart within the week. Papers of manumission and $200. Send him north. Make sure he understands, if he ever returns, if he ever speaks of this, he will hang." The overseer nodded. "And if he refuses to leave?" Vaillemont's voice turned cold. "Then we will have an unfortunate accident in the fields. Either way, he disappears." Grace's blood ran cold. She had thought Monsieur Vaillemont would keep his promise of freedom. She had not considered that the freedom came with an ultimatum: vanish or die. That night she found Daniel and told him what she had heard. His face showed no surprise. "I knew," he said quietly. "I always knew men like him do not leave loose ends." "Then you must run," Grace urged, "now before the child is born. And abandon my son, my blood. You cannot claim him, Daniel, you know that. All you can do is survive." Daniel looked at her with eyes that held a terrible, quiet courage. "Maybe survival is not enough anymore, Grace. Maybe some truths must be told, no matter the cost." Grace grabbed his arms. "They will kill you, you know they will." "Then I will die having spoken," he said, "and perhaps that is better than living in silence." Grace left that conversation with her heart shattered and a terrible certainty growing in her chest. This story could only end in tragedy. Part 5: Fight Back begins. The child was born on a warm April morning in 1843. Grace was not present for the birth. That was the domain of the white midwife and the doctor, but she heard the news within the hour. A boy, healthy, light-skinned, perfect. The relief that swept through the household was palpable. Servants whispered their congratulations. Monsieur Vaillemont sent for his finest cigars. The church bells rang again. Grace stood in the laundry room holding a tiny christening gown she had been asked to press and felt her stomach turn. The child was named Louis. Within a week, preparations began for Daniel's departure. Grace watched Monsieur Vaillemont handle the arrangements personally, papers drawn up by a lawyer from New Orleans, money counted and sealed in a leather pouch, a horse selected for the journey north. But Daniel did not seem grateful, he seemed hollow. Grace found him in the stables the night before his scheduled departure. He was sitting in the shadows, staring at nothing. "Tomorrow you will be free," she said gently. "Free?" he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "Free to carry this secret for the rest of my life, free to wonder every day how my son grows, free to know that somewhere a child with my blood is being raised to believe he is white, to believe he is better than people like me." "You are alive," Grace said. "That is not nothing." Daniel looked at her. "I have been thinking about what you said about truth and suffering, and I realize now that you were wrong." "Wrong." The truth does not always bring suffering. Sometimes the truth is the only thing that can stop suffering from spreading. He stood, his decision clearly made. "I am going to tell." Grace's heart stopped. "Daniel, no, they will kill you." "Then I will die free," he said quietly. "Not in body but in spirit. I will die having spoken the truth about what was done to me, to Madame Celeste, to that innocent child. Maybe no one will believe me, maybe I will be hanged before I can finish speaking, but I will have tried. Please, Grace begged, please think about this, wait, find another way. But Daniel's mind was set. She could see it in his eyes, that terrible, beautiful courage that comes when a person decides their dignity is worth more than their life. He did not run that night. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. The next morning, when Monsieur Vaillemont summoned him to receive his manumission papers, Daniel stood in that study and spoke words that would echo through Grace's nightmares forever. I will take your freedom and your money, Daniel said, his voice steady. But I will not take your silence. I will not spend my life carrying your shame. When I reach the North, I will tell this story. I will tell every abolitionist who will listen about Alexander Vaillemont, the plantation master who could not father his own children, who used his enslaved property to impregnate his wife. I will tell them about the child called Louis, who is my son, not yours. The room fell into a silence so complete that Grace, listening outside the door, could hear her own heartbeat. Then Monsieur Vaillemont's voice, low and venomous, "You are signing your own death warrant." "Perhaps," Daniel replied, "but I am signing it myself. That is more freedom than I have ever had." Grace heard movement, footsteps, the sound of a drawer opening. She burst through the door without thinking, without planning, driven by pure instinct. Monsieur Vaillemont had a pistol in his hand. Daniel stood perfectly still, unarmed, unafraid. "Sir," Grace said quickly, her voice shaking, "the overseer is approaching. I saw him from the window. He will hear the shot." It was a lie, but it worked. Vaillemont lowered the pistol slightly, his face contorted with rage and something else, fear. He was afraid of Daniel's truth, afraid of what it would cost him. "Get out," he hissed at Grace. "This does not concern you." "Actually," Daniel said, still calm, "it does. Grace has been a witness to all of this. She knows the truth too. Kill me and she carries it. Kill us both and people will ask questions you cannot answer." Vaillemont's hand shook. Grace could see him calculating, weighing his options, trapped by the very web of secrecy he had created. Finally, he set the pistol down. "You will take the money and the papers," he said, his voice dead. "You will leave tonight, and if you speak one word, I have friends in the North, powerful friends. They will find you, they will silence you. No one will believe a former slave over a gentleman of standing." "Maybe," Daniel said, "or maybe the truth has its own power." He took the papers and the money pouch, then turned to Grace. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trying to save me, for seeing me as human." That night Daniel left the plantation. Grace stood in the darkness and watched him disappear down the road, carrying freedom in one hand and a terrible truth in the other. She did not sleep. She sat at her small desk and wrote. April 23, 1843. Daniel is gone, the child remains, and I am left here, a keeper of secrets, a witness to sins. I do not know what will happen now. I do not know if truth will win or if power will crush it, as power always does. But I know this, I will not stay silent. When the time is right, when someone is ready to listen, I will tell this story, not for revenge, not for justice, but because some truths are too heavy to bury. Part 6, Downfall begins. Spring turned to summer. Little Louis grew fat and healthy in his cradle, doted upon by servants and celebrated by society. Madame Celeste seemed to improve somewhat. Motherhood gave her a purpose, a distraction from her guilt. But Monsieur Vaillemont grew increasingly paranoid. Grace noticed it first in small ways. He dismissed several long-serving enslaved workers without explanation, scattering them to different plantations. He became obsessive about controlling information, forbidding servants from gossiping, threatening harsh punishments for anyone who spoke out of turn. He also made inquiries about Daniel. Grace overheard him speaking with a bounty hunter who had come to the plantation in July. "A runaway," Vaillemont lied. "Dangerous. If you find him, do not bring him back. Just ensure he cannot spread lies about respectable families." The bounty hunter understood the assignment. Grace saw money change hands. She knew then that Daniel was not safe, even in the North. Vaillemont would hunt him until he was silenced permanently. That knowledge ate at her. She continued her work, quiet and efficient as always, but inside she was gathering information. She noted dates in her journal. She kept the mother-of-pearl hairpin she had found in the cabin. She listened to every conversation, observed every interaction between Monsieur and Madame Vaillemont. And she waited. In August, a traveling preacher came to the region, a man named Reverend Thomas Cole, known for his fiery sermons against the evils of slavery. He held meetings in secret, attended by free black people and sympathetic whites, speaking of abolition and human dignity. Grace attended one of these meetings. Reverend Cole was a small man with intense eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters. He spoke of slavery as a sin against God and man. He spoke of the hypocrisies of Christian slaveholders who claimed righteousness while brutality. After the meeting, Grace approached him. "Reverend," she said quietly, "I have a story about a master who committed a great sin and covered it with lies, but if I tell it, I will lose my position, perhaps my life." Reverend Cole looked at her with understanding. "Sister, truth-telling has always been dangerous for our people, but dangerous does not mean wrong. If you have witnessed injustice, you have a moral obligation to speak. Even if no one will believe me. Even then, because someday someone will, and your testimony will matter." Grace made her decision that night. She would tell the truth. Not immediately. She was not foolish enough to think she could simply walk into town and accuse Alexander Vailmont without consequences, but she would document everything. She would find the right moment, the right audience. She would ensure that Daniel's courage was not wasted. In September, something unexpected happened. Madame Celeste came to the laundry room carrying the baby. She dismissed the other servants and stood there holding Louis, tears streaming down her face. "Grace," she whispered, "I cannot keep living this lie." Grace set down the iron she was holding. "Madame. Every time I look at him, I see Daniel's eyes," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "I see the truth in his face, and I know everyone will eventually see it too. How long can we pretend? How long before someone notices, before someone questions?" Grace approached carefully. "The child looks like you, Madame. Anyone can see that." "But his eyes," Celeste insisted. "They are not Alexander's, they are not mine, they are—" She could not finish. Grace took a risk. She spoke the truth quietly. "They are his father's." Celeste nodded, sobbing now. "What have I done, Grace? What have I done to that innocent man, to this innocent child, to myself?" "You survived," Grace said gently. "In a world that gives women few choices, you did what you believed you had to do." "But at what cost?" Celeste looked at her with desperate eyes. "I think about Daniel every day. I wonder where he is, if he is safe, if he hates me." "I do not think he hates you, Madame," Grace said. "I think he pities us both." Celeste stayed in the laundry room for over an hour, speaking freely for the first time since the whole nightmare began. She told Grace about the pressure from her family, about Alexander's threats, about the nights in the cabin that still haunted her dreams. "I wanted to refuse," she said, "but I had no power, no money of my own, no place to go. My family would have disowned me if I left Alexander. I was trapped." "And now?" Grace asked. "Now I am trapped with a child who is both my greatest joy and my greatest shame." Celeste looked down at Louis, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I love him, God help me, I love him so much, but every time I hold him I remember how he came to be." She left eventually, taking the baby with her. But that conversation changed something in Grace. She realized that Celeste was as much a victim as Daniel, different circumstances, different cages, but trapped nonetheless. The true villain was the system itself, a society that gave men absolute power over women and enslaved people, a society that valued bloodlines over humanity, a society built on cruelty disguised as civilization. That night Grace wrote, September 12, 1843, "I have decided, I will not wait for the perfect moment, I will act, because if I do not, this evil will continue, other Daniels will be used, other Celestes will be trapped, other children will be born into lies, someone must break the silence." 2 days later, Grace did something she had never done before. She went to the courthouse in town and requested to speak with the circuit judge, an elderly man named Judge Harrison, known for his fairness by the standards of the time, which meant he occasionally showed mercy to black defendants. "I have testimony," she told the clerk, "regarding a matter of fraud and moral corruption at the Vailmont plantation." The clerk looked at her with suspicion. "You are making a serious accusation, girl." "I am a free woman," Grace said firmly, And yes, I am making a serious accusation, one backed by evidence. The clerk disappeared into the back rooms. Grace waited, her heart pounding, knowing she had just set something in motion that she could not stop. When the clerk returned, he said, "The judge will see you tomorrow at noon." Grace walked out of the courthouse into the bright September sunshine, and for the first time in months, she felt something that resembled hope. Part 7, Big Climax. The courthouse was a modest building, white-painted wood with a small bell tower. Grace arrived at noon precisely, wearing her best dress, carrying her journal wrapped in cloth. She was not alone. Reverend Cole had come, along with 3 other free black witnesses who had agreed to testify to her character. They sat in the back of the courtroom, a quiet show of support. Judge Harrison was a white-haired man with sharp eyes. He gestured for Grace to approach the bench. "You have made a serious accusation," he said. "You understand that bearing false witness, especially against a man of Monsieur Vailmont's standing, carries severe penalties." "I understand, Your Honor," Grace said. "I am prepared to tell the truth." What followed was 2 hours of testimony. Grace spoke carefully, precisely. She described the cabin by the river, the locked door, the pattern of visits. She described Madame Celeste's distress, Daniel's anguish, Monsieur Vailmont's threats. She presented the hairpin. She presented her journal, with dated entries describing everything she had witnessed. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "You are accusing one of the most respected planters in Louisiana of orchestrating the violation of his own wife by an enslaved man. You understand how that sounds?" "I understand, Your Honor, but it is the truth." "Do you have any witnesses besides yourself?" "Daniel himself, sir, if he can be located and brought to testify under protection." "An enslaved man's testimony," the judge shook his head, "inadmissible in Louisiana law." "He was granted manumission, Your Honor. He is legally free." The judge paused at that. "You have documentation of this manumission?" Grace's heart sank. She did not. Only Daniel had those papers. But then Reverend Cole stood. "Your Honor, I have received correspondence from an abolitionist network in Philadelphia. They have documented the arrival of a freedman named Daniel, formerly of the Vailmont plantation. He has made sworn statements before witnesses there describing exactly what this woman has testified to." He handed forward several papers. The judge read them, his frown deepening. "This is irregular," he said finally, "highly irregular. Even if true, Monsieur Vailmont committed no crime under Louisiana law, an arrangement between a man, his wife, and his property." "His property was a human being," Grace interrupted, then immediately regretted her boldness. But the judge did not rebuke her. Instead, he looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Yes," he said quietly, "he was." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison stood. "I will consider this matter. In the meantime, I am ordering Monsieur Vailmont to appear before this court to address these accusations." Grace felt her knees weaken. It was happening, the truth was coming out. 3 days later, Alexander Vailmont stood in that same courtroom, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers from New Orleans. He was composed, dignified, outraged. "These accusations are preposterous," he declared. "The delusional fantasies of a servant seeking attention. I have witnesses who will testify to my good character, to my happy marriage, to the legitimacy of my son." But then Madame Celeste entered the courtroom. Everyone turned. She was pale as death, but her voice was steady. "I wish to testify, Your Honor." Vailmont's composure cracked. "Celeste, you do not have to." "I wish to testify," she repeated louder. The judge nodded. "Approach, Madame Vailmont." What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Celeste stood before the judge and told the truth. Every terrible detail. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. She described her husband's impotence, his desperate plan, the nights in the cabin, Daniel's suffering, her own complicity. "I agreed to it," she said, tears streaming down her face. I wanted a child so badly that I agreed to use another human being like an animal. I am as guilty as my husband, but I will not let Daniel be erased. I will not let my son grow up living a lie." The courtroom erupted. Vailmont's lawyers shouted objections. Spectators gasped and whispered. But Judge Harrison brought his gavel down. "Order, order in this court." He looked at Celeste with an expression Grace could not quite name: pity, admiration, disgust, perhaps all three. "Madame," he said gently, "you understand what you are confessing to." "I understand, Your Honor. I am confessing to adultery, to fraud, to the corruption of the sacred institution of marriage." She looked directly at her husband. "And I am confessing that my husband is not a man but a coward who would destroy others rather than face his own inadequacy." Vailmont lunged toward her, but the bailiff restrained him. The judge made his ruling that afternoon. He could not punish Vailmont under Louisiana law. Technically, no crime had been committed by white people, but he could, and did, nullify the marriage on grounds of fraud. He granted Celeste a divorce and custody of Louis. More importantly, he made a statement for the record. "Let it be known that while the law may not recognize the full humanity of enslaved persons, this court recognizes the profound moral wrong that has occurred here. Monsieur Vailmont has abused his power in the most despicable manner possible. This ruling stands as testimony to that abuse." It was not justice, not really. But it was truth spoken in a public record that could not be erased. Grace stood in that courtroom and wept. Part 8: Aftermath and Closure. The scandal destroyed Alexander Vailmont. Within months, his business partners abandoned him, his social standing evaporated. Other planters refused to associate with a man who had been publicly humiliated by his own wife's testimony. He sold the plantation and disappeared. Rumors said he moved west to Texas, where no one knew his shame. Celeste took Louis and returned to her family in New Orleans. They were horrified by the scandal but could not turn away their own blood. She lived quietly, never remarrying, raising Louis with a fierce protective love. She also did something unusual. She hired Daniel's half-sisters, Hope and Grace, named after her friend, as tutors for Louis when they came of age. She made sure Louis knew the truth about his heritage from the time he was old enough to understand. Grace Turner continued working as a laundress, but she became known in abolitionist circles as a woman who had spoken truth to power. Reverend Cole helped her publish her journal in 1851 under a pseudonym. It was read by abolitionists across the North and became a small but important piece of testimony about the hidden cruelties of slavery. Daniel lived in Philadelphia until his death in 1873. He married, had children, worked as a carpenter, and became involved in the Underground Railroad. He never returned to Louisiana, but he wrote letters carefully through intermediaries to Celeste asking about Louis. She always wrote back. Louis grew up knowing he was the son of an enslaved man who had been freed, a white mother who had been trapped, and a cruel system that had damaged them all. He became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating black children after the Civil War. When he died in 1901, his obituary did not mention the scandal of his birth. It mentioned only his service, his kindness, his commitment to justice. Grace Turner died in 1890 at the age of 72. Her journal was found beneath the floorboards of her small house in 1953 during demolition. The final entry, dated April 1890, read, "I am an old woman now. My hands shake when I write, but I can still remember that young woman who stood in a courthouse and told the truth, even when truth was dangerous. I can still remember Daniel's courage, Celeste's confession, the baby who became a good man despite the circumstances of his conception. I have lived long enough to see slavery end. I have lived long enough to know that truth, even when buried, eventually finds its way to light. This is my testimony. This is my witness. May it serve someone somewhere who needs to know speaking truth is worth the cost, always." The journal is now housed in the Louisiana State Archives, a reminder of the hidden stories that shaped American history. The stories of the powerless who found power in truth. The stories that refused to stay buried. The stories that, even a century later, still echo with a simple, devastating message. We were here, we saw, we spoke. And our words remain.